Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first webinar of 2024. We will wait a moment or two for people to continue trickling in from the waiting room. I'll note that you can, captions are enabled. So if you want to see live transcription, that is available at the bottom of your screen. And I will go ahead and get started with a little bit of an introduction as folks continue to trickle in. But yeah, welcome everyone to our deep dive webinar on methane abatement policy in the context of state level climate action, especially related to recent developments, announcements from the EPA, discussions about methane at COP28. But yeah, thank you all for being here. We can go to the next slide, start with a little bit of an introduction. If this is your first time, my name is Kristen Suarez. My pronouns are she, they, and I am the State Climate Policy Manager here at Climate Exchange. I will send a link in the chat if it's your first time engaging with the network, where you can see more about our programming and research and all the things that we do here. But overall, Climate Exchange is a national organization focused on passing effective and equitable climate policy at the state level. On the next slide, you can see more insight into the SCPN, which is a network of over 15,000 folks working in and around state level climate policy. So advocates, legislators, researchers, students, all sorts of folks. And you can also see recordings and recap articles of all of our past webinars on our website, where each of our webinars will focus on a different topic within climate policy and do a deep dive, invite some experts to talk about their experiences and really build off the power of the national movement of climate advocates working in and around the state level. And we really hope to create a space here and through our other events. We have another event next week, where network members can really connect on climate policy and really deduplicate efforts across state lines. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to connect with anyone on this call, or if you have any questions about how the network can help you. I just sent my email in the chat, but that's kristen@climate-exchange.org. On the next slide, a couple ways we can support you and your work, or we can connect you to someone who can. Climate Exchange does climate policy tracking at the state level, climate policy analysis. We can provide examples for certain climate policies. We track policy in our state climate policy dashboard, which I'll send the link to there, which is also free and has 50 state pages. We track over 65 types of climate policy there across various sectors. And if we can't help you, we can definitely connect you to someone who can. And so whether that's a researcher, whether that's an advocate in your state, anyone, or legal expert, we have lots of connections. And we want to support and facilitate the work that you're already doing on the ground. Next slide, I think this is the last intro slide, is just if you are a supporter of your work, consider purchasing a ticket for our 8th annual EV raffle at carbonraffle.org. Ticket sales end February 27th, and the grand prize winner will get a fully customized EV from any manufacturer, and then we also have cash prizes for 2nd through 5th place. So we can move right along to the body of this event. We've invited an amazing panel of speakers to talk about what state actors need to know about methane policy in the context of climate action. And before I get into the introduction of our speakers, quick logistical note is feel free to use the chat box as a space for connection, sharing resources, dropping your contact information in there. But if you have any topic related questions for the panelists, please submit those through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And then if we have time at the end, we will get to those. If panelists see them and can type out a quick answer, they can do that as well. But if you send your questions in the chat, they might get lost. And then also this webinar is being recorded. So if you have to hop off, or if you know someone who would have loved to make it here, but they couldn't, you will get the recording by the end of the week, along with a recap article and a PDF of the slides. So yeah, let's get into the discussion. We have 3 amazing speakers, and we will get into each of their introductions a little more before each presentation. But we'll be talking about a lot of different aspects at the global, national, state, and local level related to methane policy, regulations, all of those sorts of things. So we will get started on the next slide with our first speaker. We have John Goldstein from EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund. And John leads EDF's, on the next slide, John leads EDF's efforts to improve regulation of the oil and gas industry and protect air and water resources at the state and federal level. And his areas of expertise include state oil and gas policy, climate policy, and federal lands. So I will hand it over to you, John. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks to all of you for your interest in joining the call today. I really appreciate it. If we could go to the next slide. So yeah, I'm John Goldstein. I lead our oil and gas methane work in the U.S. at Environmental Defense Fund. I'm based in Boulder, Colorado. I've been with EDF for about 11 years now, and it's a really exciting area. So I'm glad to be able to share this with you. You guys have probably been seeing, the news that's come out of COP with the finalization of the EPA new and existing source methane requirements. I'll be talking a little bit about that. You may have also seen on Friday, EPA released their proposal for the Methane Emissions Reduction Program, or methane fee. So I'll talk a little bit about that too. Next slide, please. So why is methane important? I kind of jokingly refer to methane as the other white meat. It's the other greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide, you all know, is super important to reduce for trying to mitigate climate change. Methane is also incredibly important. And it's because methane is so powerful in the short term at driving climate change. It's more than 80 times more potent pound for pound than carbon dioxide in the short term at, leading to, dangerous changes in our climate. So it makes it a big problem, but also a big opportunity. And that's why I think, both here in the US and abroad, you're seeing more and more regulators working to limit methane pollution, particularly from oil and gas development. Next slide, please. So it's responsible for, a quarter of the global warming that we're already experiencing, according to scientists. The oil and gas industry is the largest industrial source of it in the US. Now, it's also the primary component of natural gas. So that means that efforts to reduce methane pollution and waste not only protect us from a source of pollution, they also create more product that the natural gas industry has to sell. So really, this ought to be kind of a no-brainer, win-win sort of solution. And when we're reducing emissions of methane from well sites like the ones you see pictured here, we're also cutting other forms of pollution that lead to smog formation or ground level ozone in areas that cut pollution of things like benzene that are carcinogens. So really, it's a win kind of from a number of different perspectives. Next slide, please. And so this is just to show that, this is, again, why it's important to cut not only carbon dioxide, but methane too, and to cut them both if we really want to get the most reductions as quickly as possible in the climate problem, which I'm sure, all of us on the call today want to do. You see the lowest sort of curve here is CO2 and short-lived climate pollutant mitigation, i.e. methane. So that's the curve we definitely want to be on, and that's why it's important to both address carbon dioxide and methane as quickly as we can. Next slide, please. So where's this methane coming from in the oil and gas industry? It's coming from a lot of places, from leaks that crop up, at the thousands and thousands of well sites all across the country. But one of the big places that it's coming from are, it's sort of surprising. It's the smaller, what are sometimes called marginal or stripper wells that have been out in the oil and gas fields for decades and decades. Like any kind of production, it tends to taper off over time. And these wells, may only be eking out a little bit of energy, whether that be oil or gas, but they're responsible for a large amount of pollution, unfortunately. Mark O'Mara, a colleague of mine at Environmental Defense Fund, did a paper on this that was peer reviewed and published in an academic journal, and found that while these smaller marginal wells only account for about 6% of production in the US, they account for 50% of well site emissions. So an outsized source of pollution, and an important part of the recently finalized EPA rules, which would ensure that these sites get frequent inspections for leaks so that they get found and fixed rapidly. Next slide, please. Flaring is another important area that EPA is beginning to address in the rules that were finalized in December. Flaring is a practice that takes place in the oil and gas industry where, rather than try and get natural gas to market, this is primarily happening at oil wells in places like the Permian Basin in West Texas and Southeast New Mexico, and up in the Bakken in Western North Dakota. These are areas where they're rich in oil reserves, but when you drill an oil well, you'll almost always get some natural gas that comes up with it. And rather than invest in infrastructure to get that gas to market, they apply for permits from state and federal regulators to flare that natural gas, just to burn it off to no one's benefit. Flaring is obviously better than releasing this methane straight to the atmosphere, but it's still not great, frankly. It still leads to local pollution impacts. And what we're finding is these flares just aren't working as well as advertised. They're supposed to combust, say 98% of the gas that's being sent to them, but they're not even coming close to that. And they're producing 5 times more pollution than EPA estimates. And so, again, like, this is an important part of what EPA finalized in December. They're going to try and start to curtail the practice of routine flaring and try and get as much of that gas to market and not sent to flares as possible. And this is building from, although not quite as strong as what leading states like Colorado and New Mexico have put in place at the state level in the last few years. Next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about some of the sources of pollution at these well sites. Another important question is, who is being impacted by this pollution? Who is it that lives in close proximity to these wells? And obviously, for I'm sure many of you on the call, and for us at EDF, we're concerned about issues of environmental justice and overburdened communities getting impacted by sources of pollution like this. And it certainly is an issue in parts of the country where that is happening. And so that's an important benefit, I think, of the comprehensive rules that EPA has finalized and are now going to be going into effect. So you see here, areas like Texas and New Mexico, where you have high percentages of Hispanic or Latino populations or Native American populations living in close proximity to wells. Also in Appalachia, where you've got, elderly and low-income residents in close proximity to wells. And so these are important things to know as we look to get these rules implemented, about why it's important for these communities and how it's going to help protect them. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about Colorado and New Mexico. These are 2 leading states that have been acting on the methane issue. Colorado was actually the first state in the country to put oil and gas methane rules in place in 2014, so 10 years ago. That was under then Governor John Hickenlooper. And it hasn't stopped there. It's actually improved upon those rules 3 or 4 times since through additional state rulemakings, which has been great and been a really great model for EPA. So has New Mexico under Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, established comprehensive rules to limit pollution from oil and gas wells across the state, which again was an important precedent for EPA in taking this federal action that was finalized in December. Obviously, there's a lot of oil and gas that takes place in other parts of the country that don't have state level rules in place. Texas is a great example of that. It's responsible for the lion's share of the production and unfortunately the pollution from oil and gas in the United States. It has not acted at the state level to try and rein that in. And that's why these federal EPA standards are going to be so important to get that problem addressed comprehensively across the country and create a level playing field. You see here, this is a quote from a recent press clip talking about how the Railroad Commission, which is the weirdly named oil and gas regulator in Texas, is basically, I mean, I'll say rubber stamping flaring permits, permits where producers are asking for permission to flare. And so this is a practice that's going to have to be curtailed under the final EPA standards, and communities in proximity to these wells better protected as a result of that. Next slide, please. I mentioned that the final EPA requirements were announced at COP on the 2nd of December. You see here Michelle Lujan Grisham, the governor of New Mexico, Michael Regan, the head of EPA, Ali Zaidi, the chief climate advisor to President Biden, and my boss, Fred Krupp at EDF, making this announcement at COP. These rules are a big step in the right direction. They've been under development for the past 3 years. I've gone through a lot of public process, a lot of improvement and discussion, and we're very excited to get them implemented across the country. Next slide, please. So what exactly are these rules doing? They're building from those leading state approaches, and in some cases, actually exceeding them, and are learning from the science and the sorts of things I was sharing earlier about the problem from smaller marginal wells, the problem from flaring, to try and address the biggest sources of pollution. So the two biggest sources of pollution of methane from the oil and gas industry are, number one, leaks, or what are sometimes called fugitive emissions, and number two, pneumatics. And these are both addressed in a very strong way by EPA's final rule. So EPA has ensured that all wells are going to get comprehensive, frequent leak monitoring inspections, and that when leaks are found, they're going to get fixed. And they are requiring the swapping out of what are sometimes called pneumatic controllers across the oil and gas industry. These are devices that are designed to let a little puff of methane escape when they're doing their job, trying to regulate the pressure and temperature of the gas that's coming up out of the well. Each one of those little puffs is probably not a big deal, but when you sum up the many and many of these that are at each individual well site, and then the thousands and thousands of well sites across the US, it's actually a very significant source of methane pollution. And that's when they're working right. They can also get stuck open, and then they're just allowing that gas to vent, which is a big problem. So what EPA is requiring is that these old devices get swapped out for the latest technology, which do not bleed. They're what's called zero bleed devices. And so those are going to be installed across these well sites in the coming years under this rule. And as a result, American companies are going to be manufacturing these devices. American workers are going to be installing them on these well sites, and it shows kind of the benefit economically and job-wise of these improvements to the industry. I mentioned flaring earlier, and the improvements that EPA is going to be requiring there to try and curtail routine flaring. And then to put some numbers around this, EPA, in issuing the final rule, estimates that they're going to get an 80% reduction from covered sources when these rules are fully implemented, which is significant. 28 million, the equivalent of taking 28 million cars off the road for a year, to describe that. So this is a big deal. I would argue this is the biggest thing that the Biden administration has finalized yet in the climate space, which is super exciting. Next slide, please. Huge announcement at COP to get these rules finalized, but I think it's like the end of the first period in the hockey game. It's not the end of the game. We've still got a long ways to go because of the way the Clean Air Act works. States will have to implement these rules to cover existing sources, the thousands and thousands of wells that are out there across the U.S. Pumping oil and gas today. That EPA gives them 2 years to propose a state implementation plan that is at least as protective as what they've finalized. And for states that don't do that or do a lackluster job of a plan, EPA has the ability to implement a federal implementation plan to ensure that those sources are covered. And we believe that EPA will be doing that in parallel so that there won't be a gap. So that if a state just doesn't propose a SIP or doesn't do a good enough job, the FIP will be there ready to go so that there won't be any gap in regulation to get these sources covered. And that's what we'll be working long and hard on over the next 2 years. Next slide, please. I wanted to mention this as well because it's timely. Folks may have heard about the methane emissions reduction program. It was a part of the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed Congress last year, and is itself a big, very important piece of legislation on climate that the Biden administration was able to get across the finish line. The methane emissions reduction program was in the news over the weekend because EPA issued the proposal on Friday for how they're going to implement this. They are assigning a waste charge on excess methane emissions from oil and gas. So for companies that don't meet their targets, they will have to pay a per ton fee on methane. This is a way to use the market to try and disincent pollution. It is designed to work hand in glove with the recently finalized methane rules from EPA. One of the primary ways that companies can get exempted from this fee is if they are in a state that has a state implementation plan in place and they are in compliance with the rules. So industry, likes to complain that this is duplicative and confusing. It's really not. It's really designed specifically to dovetail and to encourage companies and states to get those plans in place so that if companies don't want to be exposed to the fee, they have that option to get into compliance and to reduce their emissions. Next slide, please. Oh, and then this is my last slide. Just mentioning, it's a really exciting space. One of the things that I'm most excited about is EDF is in the process of becoming the first nonprofit in the U.S. to launch a satellite, Methane Sat, which is pictured here. You can't tell, but that's actually me in that bunny suit in the clean room at Ball Aerospace in Boulder, taking a look at the satellite as it's under construction. Is going to be launched, in a few months. And we're very excited for the data that it's going to be streaming back to Earth. It's going to help us understand the problem better in the US and all around the world and drive even further reductions. So I think I'll leave it there, but happy to, answer any questions whenever that's appropriate.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I appreciate the conversation that's going on in the chat as well. We will move on to the next slide just to introduce our next speaker, who does not have slides, so we will stop sharing after this introduction. But our next speaker to kind of also complement what John was talking about at the federal level and bringing it federal, global, and back to state. We'll have Barry Rabe, who is the Arthur Thurnell Professor of Environmental Policy at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Barry is a political scientist who studies the political feasibility and durability of climate and environmental policy, particularly in federal systems such as the U.S. and Canada. And so I will hand it over to you, Barry, and we can go ahead and stop screen sharing while you're talking.
Thank you, Kristen, to you and your colleagues for organizing this and for inviting me. and to my co-panelists, as well as all the participants today. At one level, methane is not a new issue, uh, including the oil and gas provisions. It's also not a new state issue. Texas acknowledged it had a big problem with flaring and to try to develop initial efforts to regulate flaring in the 1950s. North Dakota, in the Bakken, decided in the 1980s with pressure from royalty holders who felt that they were being denied royalty payments because methane was exempt from the state's very high severance taxes on oil and gas production. Tried to alter the tax code, and they did for a few months, but it didn't really last. So these issues are not necessarily new, and yet the points that John has made in terms of the climate intensity and impacts are just really significant and important to weigh and consider. And I've really been struck in recent months and years at the move of methane from relative obscurity in discussions of climate change, where so much of the focus has understandably been on carbon dioxide in the media, in policy deliberations, certainly in a lot of the peer-reviewed scholarship in the social sciences on climate, which is so focused on carbon that methane is often ignored. And yet we now see these changing policies in the US. There is something called a global methane pledge, a loose but a structure of sort to hold some of these concerns and commitments that governments are making on these issues. COP28 probably spent more time on methane than any other previous version of COP. And my goodness, The Economist magazine has used not only the phrase the methane moment that was used by John, but also during one of the days of COP declared methane to be the word of the day. This is sort of an unprecedented shift and change that brings us to conversation about this. And particularly for our purposes, methane in the oil and gas sector, which is about 30% of the methane that is produced in the United States. And from all that we see and know, production of oil and gas in the United States is going to be continuing at a fairly significant rate for a considerable amount of time. Last year, Canada and the United States produced more oil and gas collectively than the entire Middle East. Energy historian Daniel Yergin is talking about the great rebalancing, the kind of shifting back to the Americas, not just North America, but the Americas in terms of leading in oil and gas production. And the US, as of last year, was the world's leading exporter of liquefied natural gas, having entered into many new contracts during that time period. We also live in a situation where there is very little political appetite to take aggressive steps to reduce the use of oil and gasoline, as we see the incredible political sensitivity in both political parties to thinking about carbon pricing, carbon taxes, other mechanisms to deal with the issues that gas prices have fallen, and with it, demand for that product is likely to go up. We are looking at an oil and gas sector that is still quite active, and for which the methane mitigation issues in the US, but also globally, are just going to be hugely significant in the years and perhaps the decades going forward. Methane also just presents an incredible opportunity for the US to lead on this issue. That includes states, that includes local communities, nationally, continentally, globally, through these steps. John very capably discusses this kind of combination or complementarity that we're seeing in terms of policy development, which is relatively unique for greenhouse gas pollutants in the United States. To combine regulatory tools with the charge or the fee pricing tool, with subsidies, with a new super emitter initiative to get a broader body of input, disclosure, you have potentially coming in play here kind of the full range of possible policy tools. We don't have this for carbon dioxide. We have it probably only in the area of hydrofluorocarbons in cooling sector transition under the Kigali Accords. So it's a very, very interesting and exciting development to see this policy regime begin to take shape. I think we also can step back for a moment and think about methane in the oil and gas sector as an example of hugely successful state policy initiative, not states across the board, but some of the states that were just mentioned, certainly Colorado, increasingly New Mexico, bits and pieces from a few other states as well. This becomes one of those relatively rare instances in American climate policy where what some states are doing and ideas beginning to diffuse really does directly guide and drive and inform federal policy. So many of the ideas and tools that are emerging from EPA, some of the things that got into the Inflation Reduction Act, have their origins in what one or more states are doing. We've really struggled with in the carbon space. There was such great hope in previous years that what a lot of states were doing in carbon cap and trade or renewable portfolio standards would become the national model. But we can now look at a federal policy regime being developed that heavily relies not just on theory, but on what actual states are doing. And with that, the role of policy ideas, what is politically and administratively feasible, and possible advantages for those industries and for those states that have taken early action to be beneficiaries, possibly paying far less under any fee, a much easier regulatory compliance process, and also demonstrating that the historic opposition of state production states and their agencies and political processes to any kind of federal engagement is something where we've really seen a divide amongst these states for the first time because of the Colorados, because of the New Mexicos and other jurisdictions. It's a very different world. That said, John said it's not the end of the hockey game. I'm speaking to you from Ann Arbor, Michigan, so I'll say it's not the end of the football game. It's a term that we're using here a lot these days. And the idea of standing up each of these policies and making them last and making them work and run the gauntlet of political challenges, inevitable litigation, other things that are going to emerge is going to be a big challenge. Most production states are not Colorado. They're not New Mexico, including their regulatory capacity. They don't have the same commitments, the staffing arrangements, the capacity, the enthusiasm for working in any of these areas. I've worked a fair amount in a number of these states, most notably Oklahoma in recent years. And I can say that when you look at many of the state agencies that are now going to have to turn to state implementation plans and thinking about standing those up, these are states that often have a hard time hiring and retaining good staff because they can transfer to industry and make more money. They tend not to have a performance or a transparency ethic, a disclosure ethic. And they are states that have really struggled with regulatory capture because state government is so close. State agencies are so close to the industry, the production industry, it's really hard for them to raise these challenges. We even see evidence in places like Canada, which really has stayed the course now for nearly a decade in their federal system, a place of lots of oil and gas production as well, to see some of the challenges that they faced in actual implementation. A great new study that came out of Carleton University in Ottawa very late last year, a peer-reviewed study, shows that you can look at two neighboring jurisdictions, British Columbia and Alberta, somewhat different regulatory regimes under the federal system and wildly different methane release numbers using data from early in this decade, the early 2020s. So even once you have these systems in place, operational, the problems don't necessarily go away. And of course, the proof is ultimately not just in creating the policy, but being able to develop in a very rigorous, empirical, reliable way that the emissions are actually going down. And again, we clearly are going to see a number of challenges, just as in the aftermath of the announcement by EPA on the methane fee or the charge system. The American Petroleum Institute has come out very aggressively at that, talking about trying to get that repealed in a future Congress. So there are some significant challenges and issues. There are, though, also some great global opportunities here and ways that the new emerging American regime could partner with other nations that are really leading the world in thinking about this. That certainly would include in Canada, but didn't get a lot of media attention in the United States. But the European Union, which has moved so aggressively in many areas of carbon and is looking at the whole model of carbon border adjustments as connecting trade to their higher commitment on carbon emission reduction, has also now put in place very tight limits on methane from oil and gas production and imports, including possibility of financial penalties. The European Union, for all the trauma that they have gone through in their energy systems and sources, particularly since the advent of the Ukrainian war, is importing 80% of its oil and gas. They see that as a trade and climate nexus issue. The top providers of natural gas now in the European Union are no longer Russia. They include Norway, and they include the United States through LNG. And whenever I speak now with my European colleagues on a range of climate policy issues, they're beginning to raise not only how we think about the nexus between carbon and trade and carbon emissions commitments, reduction commitments, but where methane might figure. And could we even begin to think about a transatlantic partnership or collaborative relations to really raise globally our expectations and standards of production of oil and gas for as long as we continue to pursue that. So there are opportunities there. And I also do hope that we begin to see from the oil and gas sector diffusion of some of these same ideas and levels of concern and commitment about mitigating methane from the other sectors that have generally received a lot less scrutiny, a lot less attention, and in the United States, a lot less policy concern and consideration. Keep in mind that when we look at methane from coal and solid waste landfills, agriculture, and livestock, that's about 70% of the American total, with some amazing state policy opportunities, but also some missed opportunities over recent years and decades where oil and gas methane has received, understandably so, tremendous attention, but those other sources have really tended to languish. Solid waste is responsible for about 15% of American methane, about 20% globally. There's some interesting potential policy and technological parallels, use of leak detection systems, monitoring, gas capture, possibly also fees and charges. Europe is very interested in this. And of course, nearly 60% of landfill methane comes from food waste, which is a huge missed opportunity in many states and many communities and many jurisdictions. So my hope would be that we can continue to move in the oil and gas methane front, but also think about some of the really great things that are beginning to happen in the US, but begin to think about how you can create cross-national partnerships in all of these areas and possibly take some of this great work in the oil and gas sector that's beginning to emerge and think about some of the same questions in these other sectors of methane that have really continued to go largely ignored or at least underplayed in their consideration. That said, considerable progress and be very exciting to watch and see how all of the state and federal policy regime moves forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barry. That was an amazing kind of comprehensive review of the different types of things. I'm glad that you touched on the other sectors outside of oil and gas, because that's also, I'm seeing a lot of chats and questions about that. So if we have time at the end, I think we'd love to circle back to those other sectors. But we will move on to our final presenter, Kaylee Shoup. Kaylee was born and raised in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and left home in 2020 and returned in 2018, and quickly realized that the community she had called home had been transformed by the Permian oil boom. In 2019, after watching a young friend battle a rare and aggressive cancer and her own mother deal with ovarian cancer diagnosis at the age of 50, she began to realize that she knew an abnormal amount of young people dealing with devastating diagnoses. This is when her passion for environmental activism was truly awakened. She began working with Citizens Caring for the Future in 2020 and feels incredibly grateful to know and work alongside other concerned citizens, grassroots activists, and environmental stewards in the Permian and the state of New Mexico. And so I will hand it over to you, Kaylee, to talk about your years of experience working on these sorts of things on the ground in New Mexico.
Perfect. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Alrighty. Okay, can you see? We're good to go. Okay. Alrighty, so my name is Kaylee Shoup. I'm a community organizer with a very, very small grassroots environmental advocacy group called Citizens Caring for the Future. We're based in the heart of the Permian Basin in Southeast New Mexico. And I'm sure you all are aware, the Permian Basin includes Southeast New Mexico and then also West Texas. And obviously, the approaches to how the industry is regulated in both of these states is very, very different. To my knowledge, we are pretty much the only group of our kind in the Permian Basin that is working in this environmental and climate advocacy space. And when I say only group of our kind, I mean the leadership is comprised of people that live and call the Permian Basin their home. And there is a reason for that. That is because this is an area that is really quite conservative and the culture is very rooted in, oil and gas. And so people pay a very high price for speaking out on these things. It can come with, danger and things like that. And so our mission is to really try to shift the culture here on the ground, but then also just shine a spotlight on the Permian Basin, on a national and global level, as it's the most active basin, oil field producing basin in the country. And it also is a huge contributor to methane pollution. And it's likely where the last barrel of oil will be pumped in the United States. So that's really always a goal of ours, is to keep talking about that and bringing up that reality. So Citizens Caring for the Future actually got started through an immersion retreat led by a group called Interfaith Power and Light, and then also Earthworks. And during these immersion retreats, folks from, around the country, around New Mexico, and from the local community here in Southeast New Mexico go out into the field and look for methane emissions with the FLIR video camera that Earthworks uses. And people getting to see this invisible pollution, and actually when it comes to life for them, it really catalyzes them to take action. And so there was one of these retreats in 2019. This was before I came along. And there was some local people from Carlsbad that went and partook in this event. And they came back and they gathered as a group and were talking about what they saw and sharing their concerns. And they realized that everyone from the area was concerned about the same things. We were concerned about air quality, our health, the cost of housing, traffic, all these different things. And it was the first time that these folks had heard their concerns echoed within our community. And so at that point, they decided, we want to step up and create a steering committee and get this little group off the ground. And so with the help of Interfaith Power and Light, and then also Earthworks, Citizens Caring for the Future was born. And I would say the very first thing that they did was they spoke at a hearing that the New Mexico Environment Department was organizing when they were creating the methane regulations, the state methane regulations. And this hearing actually took place in Carlsbad. And this little small group of people from the area went to this hearing and spoke in support of strong regulation. And as I mentioned, this is quite a politically extreme region. And so I really cannot adequately express how brave that was of them to go into that room and talk how they did. And I started my job during the pandemic, so I still haven't had to do that to this day. And it was very just brave of them. And I really tip my hat to all those folks that started this. All that to say, though, the creation of the New Mexico methane regulations fostered community. And it gave people something to focus on. Sometimes, especially here in the Permian, there are so many thousands of oil and gas wells, and we're so inundated by billion-dollar companies having a hand in our local community. And so it's really hard to figure out, what can you even do if you're concerned about this? So working on this regulation really gave Citizens Caring for the Future a direction to go. And that's one of the things we were really heavily involved in. until their passage in 2022. And that passage, so the two main things that the regs did here in New Mexico is they require all operators to capture 98% of produced natural gas by the end of 2026, and they prohibit routine venting and flaring. And this really addresses, you know, a lot of EJ issues, because New Mexico is a state that is 53% people of color. And we have approximately 80,000 people that live within a half-mile of oil and gas wells. So we have the southeast corner, which is the Permian Basin, but we also have the San Juan Basin in the northwest corner. And they have a very large Native American population, and about 17.1% of that population lives within a half-mile of an oil and gas facility, and yet they only make up 10.5% of the whole state's population. So these regulations really, they addressed a lot of EJ concerns as well. When we talk about methane pollution, we often talk about it on this really large scale of cutting methane pollution to take care of the climate crisis, but methane pollution comes with a lot of other pollutants, things like VOC, as John mentioned, benzene, known carcinogens that cause, you know, these health impacts that really hurt people here on the ground. And so because of that, we focus as CCFF, we focus on, you know, making sure we have strong regulation and that it's enforced, but then also just educating people and letting them know that, you know, there is a ban on routine venting and flaring in New Mexico. And that gets them actually looking at flares when they drive around and thinking about these things. And we also have an air purifier program where we distribute air purifiers to people that are living, you know, within a half-mile of oil and gas sites, because this air quality does have an impact on their health. And so with that being said, we do have these great regulations. But the Permian Basin is West Texas and Southeast New Mexico, and emissions don't know borders. So for that reason, sometimes here on the ground in Southeast New Mexico, we do not always feel the benefits of those regulations, in part due to Texas, but then also because, you know, regulation cannot outrun the fact that we are just continuing to produce oil and gas, and that the industry continues to grow and grow and grow in the midst of a climate crisis. So we have to work with all the tools in our toolbox to make sure that we're really putting a dent into these emissions. And that's why these EPA regulations are so exciting, because it's just another tool in the toolbox, and it puts a dent in what is happening in West Texas, which, you know, then blows over to New Mexico. And we're really excited to just even have more tools to make sure that we're taking care of this pollution. Unfortunately, right now, there is a research project going on, and Citizens Caring for the Future is working very closely with this group. It's headed up by Dr. Gunnar Schad with Texas A&M in the Atmospheric Sciences Department. USC is involved, University of California, University of Toronto, and then also Dr. Detlef Helmig with Boulder Air. And, you know, they are monitoring the air emissions here in the Permian. They have a very high level air monitor that is set up in Southeast New Mexico. And sadly, in the past 6 months, they have recorded 31 days in which ground level ozone levels have surpassed the Environmental Protection Agency's 8-hour national ambient air quality standard. And so we should be deemed a non-attainment zone, and we're still not deemed a non-attainment zone. And so that's, you know, that's another tool in the toolbox, and just working towards really truly making a dent in these emissions so that we can see a change here on the ground. Something that, you know, I'm excited about though with these EPA regulations is, you know, just kind of the window into the future that they provide for community members here. And by that, I mean, you know, the Permian Basin, especially here in New Mexico, is we're always thinking of the dilemma of balancing like economic interest with environmental responsibility. Here in New Mexico, a large portion of the state revenue is from oil and gas. Southeast New Mexico is really wholly dependent on the industry. And for people that live here, thinking about a transition is very scary because, you know, they can't imagine how the world could look any different. And when you think about, you know, renewable energy and things like that, and wind energy and solar energy, I think a lot of people look out to our landscape and think to themselves, well, we're already inundated with all this infrastructure. We don't even have space to do that. Sure, we're a great place to have these things, but it's not going to create the amount of jobs that the oil industry is currently employing people with. And people just see all of these problems and, you know, feel a lot of fear. But I think these EPA methane rules, they really present an opportunity for people to again see a window into a new world by incentivizing like the adoption of advanced technologies and practices that reduce methane emissions. And it gives workers other opportunities, you know, in retrofitting equipment or methane mitigation jobs and cleanup, things like that. And I think it's a way for them to really begin to realize what maybe this new economy and this new world might look like. And then the MERP thing, something that's exciting about that is just, again, the opportunity that it gives frontline communities and local communities to engage with industry and policymakers, and just to ensure that these regulations are implemented and enforced. And so that's very exciting, again, to have that opportunity for that dialogue to get started, as it definitely is going to take local community members paying attention to these things along with state and federal agencies. A problem that New Mexico really faces is our environmental agencies are very underfunded and extremely understaffed. So we have an issue where a lot of the great regulations that we have don't get enforced, and there are violations every day, and we don't really even know how many. I refer to this area as the wild, wild west. And so it's exciting to have an opportunity for even more people to get engaged, to hopefully rein in the emissions from the oil and gas industry as much as possible. So thank you all for letting me speak to you today, and I'll pass it back to you, Kristen.
Thank you so much, Kaylee, and I really appreciate your discussion from the start of the coalition. I think that a lot of folks in the space think about methane and regulating climate regulations and policy in general as something, you know, in the name of global climate change. And I always, you know, we at Climate Exchange want to bring that back to where these movements have come from. And also that these are real people with local health issues that arise, not only humanity ending climate change, but local issues. Climate change is happening now and has been on the ground. So I appreciate your background. That was our last presentation of the event. I think we have time for maybe one question. I've been hearing a lot about, and also just a reminder, this will all be recorded and sent out to all of you. But I've seen a lot of questions related to communicating the problem and why methane is kind of coming center stage now. And I've also seen a lot of, you know, questions around non-oil and gas sources of methane emissions. So maybe I'll combine the two and see if our speakers have any thoughts on, any of our panelists have any thoughts on how we can use what we've learned from oil and gas regulation of methane into other sectors, into agriculture, into food waste. And maybe, you know, any thoughts on that, on communicating the issue, but also on moving outside of oil and gas, but towards the majority of methane emissions from other sources. Any thoughts from any of our panelists on that?
I can take a stab, and you know, I bet Barry has some thoughts here too, but it's definitely where EDF began on the methane issue, is oil and gas methane, but it's not where we've ended. EDF's getting increasingly involved in landfills and in ag sources. It's not an area that I work on directly, but it's definitely an area of interest to the organization. And I'd love to be able to plug in, you know, my colleagues that work in those areas to be able to sort of continue this conversation.
I guess I'd say just a couple of things. One is that I really do think there is a need to build as broad and informed a coalition as possible on this issue, because for a long time, certainly in many states, but also in different agencies, methane is a tightly contained area, but it tends not to get into that broader conversation. And especially when we begin to talk about other sectors and begin to think about, how do you process your food waste? What do you eat? Where does garbage go? Each one of those involves different kinds of political coalitions and the like. I also noticed in the chat a number of questions in the agriculture and livestock area. And this is one where I don't think any nation in the world has really cracked this one. It's a really, really tough one. But I've been struck, and here I'm playing more the professor role. I have seen more and more of my students, undergraduate and graduate, in the last 2 or 3 years, really thinking about agricultural or livestock methane, nitrous oxides from fertilizers and others than ever before. It's, this is the year of Farm Bill consideration, and I think there's some really interesting opportunities to begin to explore and push that issue.
Thank you so much. Any thoughts, Kaylee, on the types of communication strategies that are effective in getting people to care about an issue that, like methane, which I feel like is hard for a lot of people to like really grasp. It's not an extremely tangible thing, and it's not something people have been talking about, like carbon dioxide. But yeah, I know that's a huge question, but effective communication strategies and talking points that really communicate the message to folks that maybe haven't worked in methane before.
Yeah, in terms of, addressing methane in the oil and gas industry, I think coming at it from the human angle and talking about the health impacts and the different pollutants that come with methane pollution, that has tended to be the best way for us to engage with people. Also, though, climate, we're in the climate crisis right now. And in the Permian Basin, like, not only are we dealing with the environmental impacts, but also the climate impacts. This is a desert. So we're dealing with record heat, aridification, drought. And so people can really feel that. And so also bringing it into a bigger global context at this point, because, the problems are right there in front of us. That's another way to communicate with folks. Again, though, this area is always a bit difficult because of the political dynamics and where people are getting their information from. And so we always kind of have to be cognizant of who we're talking to and, keeping safety first and foremost in our minds.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm sorry to have you answer that so quickly at the end, but I appreciate your conciseness. But all right, we will go ahead and start to wrap up. Thank you all so much for your time. All three of our speakers, John, Barry, and Kaylee. As usual, a recap article and the recording with chat box access and slides will be sent out by the end of the week. And if you haven't already, feel free to register for our not our last SCPN call in 2023, but that was an incorrect link. But our SCPN call next week, where we have 6 states will be talking about what is on the docket in legislative sessions and climate policy in their state. So I will send the correct link for that here. But thank you again to everyone. Feel free to reach out to me, Kristen, at climateexchange.org. And I will connect you to whoever you need to be connected to. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, Kristen.
Bye-bye.